All right, well, let's get started. Christian is here. He should walk in any minute. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And I know in the audience I see a number of our planning commissioners. Thanks for joining us, as well as others. For many years, we have met once, twice a year with the Planning Commission for various reasons. Sometimes to look at the work plan and get some ideas, thoughts from our planning commissioners about what we might be working on. We obviously see many of you through the course of the year at our work sessions when we have planning items and issues. And today, the purpose of this meeting is to go back a bit to the discussions that have been held the last couple of years around the site plan review process and see what, in fact, we've gotten to and what reforms, what changes in the process about the way the site plan review process works have been implemented, and what questions and issues there are for discussion and board input in that regard as well. I think it's fair to say that while we are a community with many advisory groups and bodies in all sorts of areas, and they all add to the the decisions we make and the issues we tackle, none is more important than the Planning Commission. And some of this is to better understand how that works, to give some guidance for the future, and to ensure that relationship, the roles and relationships, Planning Commission, board members, and staff are working and as smooth as they can be. So input from us will be helpful, and we want to hear from you as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric Gutschall, the chair of the Planning Commission, for any opening comments you want to help frame the conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're pleased to be here. I think it's actually really important for the board and for the commission to have this opportunity to kind of set a path forward for where the commission is going to go as we continue to evolve as a community. I think I'm mindful of the fact that on our commission now we have a relatively newer, fresher commission. We've got 4 members appointed just in the last couple of months. And also on the board, frankly, with your retirement next year, Mr. Chair, the board, 4 of the 5 members of the board will be in their first term. So there's been a lot evolving in the community, a lot of heavy, deep focus on the role of the Planning Commission and the role of long-term planning in Arlington, and how we can respond to changing market conditions, but yet hold on to those values of strong planning and holding to our planning processes and documents. I think that the commission, from my time on the commission, I expect this to continue into the future, is very eager and willing to adapt as the county continues to evolve in how we do things, but also eager to have that input from the board tonight in terms of what's the best way that the commission can be effective, can provide good advice to the board in our land use planning and decision-making processes, and also work collaboratively and constructively with staff, with other commissions, and with our applicants and developer community. So thank you for the opportunity.
That's great, thanks. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bob Duffy is going to walk through a number of slides. Before he does that, I wanted Samia to make sort of an introductory remark, and we'll look forward to the conversation we're going to have this evening.
One remark.
So just quickly, I just wanted to touch on the presentation that'll be provided by Bob Duffy is going to provide just a framework for the discussion and the topics that have been listed on the agenda. And generally, there's been a lot of discussion over the last several years about site plan process changes and improvements to the review process. And there are 2 components to that Bob will go through in the presentation that'll help focus the discussion. One is recommendations that were established by the Site Plan Review Committee Working Group. Several big ideas that came out of that. That was formed in 2012, and those ideas came forward a number of years later. And then the second is improvements made by staff to its administrative review processes related to site plan applications and review of those. And so those are going to be the things that Bob focuses on, and the second component of that, the staff process changes, really were meant to complement the SPRC working group recommendations, but there are two different components of review changes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Duffy.
Thanks.
Assistant County Manager Byrd, and we're fortunate to have Samia with us tonight because in her former role, she was very actively involved and really played a leadership role throughout her career to date on many of the things we'll touch on tonight. Again, as Samia has indicated, what I'm going to try to do, county board members and planning commissioners, is give a really brief overview to set the stage for your discussion in terms of the roles and organization of the Planning Commission, just to give a framework, as Samia indicated. And then I'll give an overview of two important reports that were completed in 2014 and 15. And that's the report of the Site Plan Review Committee's Working Group and the Site Plan Application and Administration Process Improvements, really led by staff. So let's start. And just very briefly, we're fortunate in Arlington County to have a very active and committed Planning Commission that's enabled by the Code of Virginia. This slide shows basically the general summary of the enabling authority and the basic roles of the Planning Commission. As the board and commissioners know, the Planning Commission plays a key role.
Can I just ask one quick question about, we don't, some people like to follow. Do we have this presentation? I don't. Oh, it's not in iLegislate. We're not seeing it. It's not there. Yeah. No, that's all. Because some of us look for it and we don't want to be distracted by looking for it. It doesn't seem to be available through iLegislate yet. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay, well, either way, keep going with this, and when we get it, just keep refreshing every once in a while.
Okay.
Up if you want to follow it on your iPad.
So again, Virginia enables communities to have a planning commission. We've been fortunate since 1956 to have an active and committed planning commission who focuses on our comprehensive plan, strategies for implementation of that plan, the review 5 years periodically of our comp plan, and a number of other duties. So that's the basic authority. And again, the Planning Commission establishes a set of bylaws which they maintain on an ongoing basis. Their bylaws were last revised on July 2nd, 2013. And you see in this slide an outline of what those bylaws cover. And this is really the guiding principles, if you will, of the commission to promote orderly development and advise the county board, which certainly the commission does, defines how many members, the officers, their meetings, the three committees, and I'll go into those three committees in a little more detail, how records are kept by Giselle Johnson, who serves as the clerk of the Planning Commission, how basic public notices are filed, and how periodic amendments are handled. So the bylaws are an important aspect of the Planning Commission. But most importantly, our Planning Commission is divided into three standing committees you see from this chart. And the chairs of each of these committees are appointed annually by the commission chair. One thing I've included in this description is from the 2016 annual report, the number of meetings, public hearings that the commission and the planning committees conduct. It's a tremendous commitment of work. It is just tremendous. From my experience, it's just an outstanding level of commitment that our citizen planners provide. So we have three committees. The Site Plan Review Committee, which we'll talk a lot about this evening, is part of their mission and the work that's been done to date. They advise the Planning Commission on all site plans, major and minor amendments, and other requests for special exception. And most importantly, they provide the forum for reviewing and commenting on site plans. And that's the Site Plan Review Committee process. 2016, they held 23 meetings, including 2 joint meetings with the Form-Based Code AUG. The Long Range Planning Committee advises the Commission on land use, urban design, and long-range plans, including the comprehensive plan. And recently, they provided an update to the board on the comp plan, which is required every 5 years. And LRPC met 12 times during 2016. And finally, ZOCO, the Zoning Ordinance Committee, which advises the Commission and certainly onto the county board on all amendments related to our zoning ordinance. And again, they're very active as well. It's important to note that the Site Plan Review Committee was created by the county board in 1972. That's when the county board first charged the Planning Commission with having this standing committee to serve at that time as the design subcommittee. And the purpose was to review site plans for consideration and advice to the county board, which the committee does today. At that time, it was a much smaller committee focused primarily on design details. It included an architect, a landscape architect, and 2 other individuals. But today, since it leads basically our overall community review process before the hearings start with the commission and board, and provides an avenue for other boards and commissions to collaborate, it's grown into a much larger committee, and certainly no less important. So what I'd like to do is provide an update, and as the chairman indicated, just go back a bit and give an update on the 2 sets of recommendations that have been provided previously to the county board, the planning commission. And the first stems from the Site Plan Review Committee Working Group. You may recall that this group was established back in April 2013 by the Site Plan Review Committee. There were 18 members of the community that served on this committee, from the business, planning commission, other boards and commissions were represented, and there were 3 staff, Ms. Bird, myself, and Lisa Marr from DES. And on September 16th of 2014, they conducted a work session like we're having tonight to review those conclusions and preliminary recommendations. The second thing I'll go through tonight is actually the administrative process improvements that staff developed. While this was certainly an independent effort by staff that focused on our administrative regulation 4.1, which governs the submittal of site plans in Arlington County, it was sort of influenced certainly by what we heard from the working group. And again, as you'll see in our presentation, plays a key role in the site plan process. Just very briefly, I think it's important to review the site plan process. And this diagram shows the 6 phases today of the site plan review process that begin with a very early concept and preliminary submission, running to final submission, to the actual site plan review process. And it's here with the Planning Commission and its Site Plan Review Committee. And there are operating guides that are very important as part of to help inform and influence that process. And we'll talk about those this evening. And again, final plan submission before the public hearings and post-approval. The other element that I mentioned before is the Administrative Regulation 4.1 that the county manager approves, that guides not only the Department of Community Planning and Housing Development, but also the other county departments that are integrally involved throughout the site plan process. And this deals with the very key elements of site plan application, submission, the content, and what is ultimately is received by the commission and the Site Plan Review Committee. So a little background on the Site Plan Review Committee process, and 2 things we'll discuss at some length tonight: the operating guides of the commission, as well as the 4.1 standards. Now, the next slide, here are the operating guides. I just want to give a quick overview of what exists today. And these were last revised in 2010. And historically, it's the Planning Commission members who have maintained and updated these guides. And you can see there are 2 parts, one that deals with the Site Plan Review Committee and the other with the Site Plan Chair. They cover everything from the scope, when a site plan review is required, the members, the roles of the chair, the meetings, and most importantly, the agenda for a site plan review process. There's some ground rule discussion and what materials are submitted for the meeting, and a brief outline of what a site plan report from the committee and the chair would consist of. And again, there's a second part to this that lays out the responsibilities and that guides the chair in his or her role through that process. So this is critically important for the Planning Commission. But again, the second part of this, which is distinctly different, and this stems from the zoning ordinance, Article 15 of the ordinance, are the administrative regulations that the county manager approves that deal with plan submittal process and requirements from the concept to the preliminary final filing. It defines what types of plans, what checklists are used, how various calculations are performed. It's very technical and essential for our professional staff to utilize that and have a common framework, if you will, to guide that effort on a day-to-day basis. That regulation also covers how we administer and review phase development site plans, the Crystal City Block Plan, which is a new type of phase development site plan, if you will, that the Crystal City Sector Plan brought forward, how we advertised, and most importantly, the 55 standard site plan conditions that are reviewed on an annual basis. So again, those are the two core elements that guide staff and certainly guide the Planning Commission through the site plan review process. I think it's important to note that when you look back over the many reports and the work that was done both by the site plan review committee as well as by staff, these objectives came through, and certainly they're still prominent today and no less important today in terms of ensuring that our processes improve site plan review efficiency, effectiveness, and timeliness. They introduce greater consistency and clarity of the process, reduce applicant costs and uncertainty, facilitate early, timely, and coordinated review, facilitate effective, productive, responsive, and inclusive community participation, one of the key roles of the Site Plan Review Committee, timely communication, and most importantly, provide high-quality redevelopment that advances county goals, policies, and plans. I think I said objectives that was true in 2014 and 15, and certainly no less true today. So in 2015, at a work session by the county board, after the Site Plan Review Committee work group completed their work, the chair of that group, Commissioner Cole, made a presentation at the work session, and the recommendation defined a series of big ideas or recommendations. And I'll summarize them, and we can come back to these in more detail as your work session continues. But first, it was to clarify the roles of other advisory commissions, committees, and boards, and civic associations and site plan reviews. Today, there are at least, in the past, there have been at least 40 individuals representing various civic associations, committees, boards, and commissions that sometimes are at that table. That's a tough job to manage a large number of interested parties, but again, the Site Plan Review Committee brings the various stakeholders together with staff and to review projects with the applicant, and the commission wanted to be sure that there was clarity in what those roles were of those committees and commissions and how they work together, and most importantly, how they would submit their reports and advice to both the commission and the county board. At that time, there was a proposal to establish an optional preliminary review, and the commission heard that there was a need at some point in the process before the formal Site Plan Review Committee process would begin to provide an applicant with an opportunity, if they elected to do so, optional, to make a presentation to that Site Plan Review Committee with an abbreviated set of drawings and material to receive some guidance from the Site Plan Review Committee, the Planning Commission. There was discussion about revising the Site Plan Review Committee membership. The agenda was a major point of consideration in terms of how to structure that to better serve both the committee, the community, and the applicants, and we're still having that discussion In fact, the chair of the SPRC, we've been discussing that over the last several weeks in anticipation of moving forward. Clarifying the role of the site plan review chairs, again, providing clarity and possibly updating those operating guides to support the committee and support the chair would be very important. At the time, there was an unevenness, I think, to the how the committee agendas were structured and managed and led, and I think that's improved significantly, I think, as you'll hear tonight. And finally, establish clear expectations for materials, particularly related to the preliminary site plan review. So there were these 8 big ideas that the site plan review committee advanced, and we can come back and talk about those in more detail. The next slide really are the improvements that staff, both in planning, DES, and the departments, worked on, again, certainly influenced by the work of the site plan review work, but also to improve our performance as well. And based on the work that we did, those administrative requirements were updated in July of 2016. And before we came to the manager to seek those revisions, we presented them and reviewed them with the Site Plan Review Committee on May 19th of 2016. So in this slide, you'll see the staff recommendations, and those that are in bold and underlined are those that we've implemented. We've introduced an optional concept site plan review process. For decades, this process has been underway, but there were no clear rules. The coordination between departments needed to be called out, what type of report we provide to an applicant. And so we worked through a series of modifications to make this an actual part of the site plan application administration guidelines or standards, and it was adopted again in July of 2016. So we now have an optional concept plan review that's completed before the preliminary filing, and it deals with everything from the various technical requirements to the basic issues related to our plans and policies in Arlington. There was discussion about a streamlined or shorter review of certain site plan applications. We've not moved forward with that because looking back to 2014 and 15, when we were tracking the number of days that were required to move a site plan from the preliminary stage to actual consideration by the board, at that time it was almost 306 days. And through a number of the improvements and work we've done with the Site Plan Review Committee and recommendations here, we've cut that in almost half today. And so you'll find where site plan review processes were involving 6+ meetings, today they're really around 120 days. And so it's been vastly improved, I think, by not only, primarily I think, by the work that we've done with the commission. The Planning Division considered the idea of bringing the acceptance of the actual applications from the 10th floor zoning office to our office on the 7th floor. However, we stepped back from that because a new permitting system that's underway and the One Stop Arlington effort that's underway, and we'll need to revisit that and what our roles are respectively with zoning once the new permitting system's in place. The director of the Department of Community Planning, Housing and Development is now reviewing and finalizing and signing the letters of acceptance, which take an applicant from the preliminary to the final stage, which prepares them for the Site Plan Review Committee. We discussed the possibility of creating a standard site plan condition to amend, to enable more administrative amendments during project construction. We haven't gotten there with that. In fact, there are some issues with that, some of them legal, that we discussed with the county attorney. And we also discussed whether it was possible to take the 55 standard site plan conditions and creating more of an administrative guide or requirements to that, but again, with a new permitting system. And I think Arlington's history with the site plan special exception process presented some issues for that. And so we have not pursued that at this point. We have revised the format and content of the letter from the Planning Commission to the County Board after a great deal of research and discussion. We recommended to review and revise the SPRC chair report format, content, and presentation. That's part of the operating guides that we'll discuss further tonight, and we think that will be very important, again, for the SPRC and certainly for the PLIT Commission and Board moving forward. I think we've done a fair amount of work in looking at the roles of planning staff throughout the Site Plan Review Committee process, and I think working with the chairs of SPRC to ensure that we could minimize the amount of time in the process. And at this point, that still evolves, but I think we've made some great progress. And one thing that we observed in many of the site plan review processes is that periodically there would be an issue that would come up. And that issue would stall a site plan review process for a number of reasons. And by working with the commission, with the chairs, the Site Plan Review Committee, we've overcome that, and I think it helps move the process along in a much smoother and comprehensive way. And lastly, and we'll talk about this further tonight in the work session, training is going to be utmost importance for the Planning Commission SPR chairs. Chairman Gutschall mentioned the 4 new commissioners, and it's imperative that we continue to provide training resources, orientation, and development resources with the commission. So, Mr. Chair, that is my overview. I'll be happy to come back with more details if there are questions, but I think the next item on the agenda is the areas of discussion.
Okay, that sounds good. I'm not sure we need any discussion now. Anybody have any? That was sort of background and sort of an update on the work of that working group and then what actually has been implemented. Are there questions about any of this?
One clarifying question. I know we've talked a lot about the concept review process and the administrative level, but I noted in the summary of working group recommendations, you noted an optional preliminary review there as well. Would that be an optional preliminary review by SPRC or Planning Commission in addition to the pre-plan submittal review?
Concept from the working group was to have a optional review that would be elected by the applicant to convene the full site plan review committee and to get an early read before they start the SPRC process. And the intention was that that could help set the agenda, narrow the field of various policy and planning issues. At the concept level for staff, that's before the applicant gets to even a preliminary filing, and it provides us with an opportunity to give them early guidance, as we have done for many years, but now in a format that's clear, consistent, and constant. And it's been well received by applicants to date. So they have distinct differences, and we'll probably talk more about that tonight.
And to confirm, the latter has been implemented, the former has not.
That's correct.
And I just want to clarify on the staff conceptual review. That was something that we were already doing. So all we did was formalize something that was already happening. So typically applicants would come in prior to making a submission or a preliminary filing, and they wanted to review some concepts for a proposal with staff. And they were doing that with a lot of different departments individually. So what we did was formalize that process so that there's one point of contact to make it a little bit more efficient, so that then we could also provide documentation of, the discussions that we were having.
Can I add one context to that too? And it's another way this sort of surfaced along the years is there was a point in time where the board was interested in focusing on architecture and the quality of architecture. So maybe 8 years ago, we held a number of community forums and had the post architect and others here to give us feedback and make suggestions, a bunch of community forums with businesses to give us suggestions, because we felt we were doing a lot of the practical nuts and bolts of smart growth well, but that in the process, our buildings weren't dramatic or architecturally interesting enough. And were we missing out on that? And how could we bring that element to the picture? And one of the suggestions from the development community, as well as others, was that too often they had already invested a significant amount of money in their architectural design before they even really got into the process. And so the suggestion from some of these groups was give them an opportunity to come in earlier without having made that big investment that is sometimes hard to change, and look at things in a more conceptual way. What would be the massing and the step downs and the density questions more in block form, so that some of the, and then the other big thing, which was to, hire really top quality architects at the front end. And in fact, people did start doing that and it started to change. But this piece was also driven, I thought, tell me how it fits in with this question, this issue. I thought it was trying to get more of a review of what we do almost in a GLUP study now, so that you're not forcing a developer or even encouraging them to spend a lot of money on architects and the refined designs early on.
It really includes two levels. It does include that technical level, but we do, through the new standards, ask the applicants to submit massing diagrams to begin to think about height and how building step backs transition to neighborhoods, the edge conditions and so on that many of our plans address. So we do ask them to do that, and sometimes it requires several iterations to get there. But Mr. Chairman, it's both of those things. It's dealing with the nuts and bolts, the technical aspects of our zoning ordinance, but also begin to think about urban design and urban form.
When they come into you, Bob, with this optional concept site plan review, right, which is available, have they usually have a beautifully designed building at that point?
The intent is not to do that.
Right,
The intent is to start now. And we have that discussion early on with applicants. I think we've had one recently where we had an application that started at a much higher level, and I think it would have benefited from more conceptual level of review before it got to the commission and board. But in several cases to date, it's come in as massing diagrams to understand the relationship to the build environment, the context, and also give us an understanding of how the massing and form will implement policies and plans that have been approved by the board. So again, it's been well received, and I think it's making a difference.
Okay. Other questions at this point? John?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure how we're framing tonight's discussion, but just another question on this in terms of the optional review. Could you remind me what the role of the Planning Commission is in that review, if any? And I'd also appreciate the chair of the Planning Commission's perspective on this.
If I could have the slides back, because I'd like to go to one of the slides that I had just a minute. So again, this is the site plan. It's slide 6 that we presented earlier. And again, it shows the 6 phases. And again, the administrative regulation 4.1, which is derived again from our zoning ordinance, allows the manager, with recommendations from staff, to put the procedures in place that guide each of these phases of the process. And the concept level, which is now part of phase 1, we define what we require the applicant to submit, what the basic procedures are, and how the interdepartmental team will consider that. It's when we get to phase 3, after the preliminary plan has been accepted and the applicant's filed for the final site plan review, does the Planning Commission Site Plan Review Committee kick off. And so this concept review occurs very early in the process, and that, again, has been very helpful, I think, to the applicants to date.
Mr. Duffy, is there any sort of notice? What communication or alert goes to the PC at phase 1 and 2? Is there any communication?
Not until the site plan, it meets the preliminary phase and it's accepted, do we then begin to post all that material to the website, to the site plan review committee page. It's all very preliminary, because the applicant could decide not to file. They could learn something from the concept plan review that would indicate, I don't think I'm ready to go there yet. And so until we have a site plan accepted, the final has been submitted, and we're ready to proceed and meet with the chair of the site plan review committee, does all that really become part of the public domain?
Okay. Mr. Gutschall, what's your perspective here?
Well, there's a lot of layers to this, actually, in terms of how you break it down, because I think that from my observation, what can sometimes happen is that while the applicant has the benefit of having those early conversations with staff to make sure, if something's a non-starter, right, that you want to, or if there's some very particular issue that really just needs to be worked out before they make that investment in the quality architecture, et cetera, that gets cleared up at the staff level and worked through. I certainly see the benefit to our overall process in that. However, the perhaps unintended consequence that can sometimes happen is that by the time it gets to phase 3, where we actually enter the SPRC process, they have now worked through some basic decisions about circulation, general massing, et cetera, because it comes to the SPRC having made that investment in the architect and the architecture generally. And so what that means is that the applicants, without the availability of an opportunity to come to the community, the SPRC, before they make those investments, there's no chance for the community to weigh in on some of those fundamental issues that may or may not be non-starters for staff, but may, in fact, be major issues for the community. And occasionally, I think we have seen sometimes where those can be at odds, and where there is a sense at SPRC that an application is already vested to a certain point, where the opportunity for the SPRC to weigh in on something that is fundamental, like a loading dock location, for example, or the orientation of a lobby, or I actually think, I don't know that this is was the exact issue in terms of the concept review, but I think it's illustrative nonetheless, because I remember what a great comment it was from our former Commissioner Rosemary Ciotti at the Blue Goose for Marymount, where there was a fundamental issue that had to do with the level of the plazas, and they were multi-level, and she was advocating strongly on SPRC, they need to all be the same level, you ought to be able to do this. And the pushback was, well, we've already designed, we've already laid out all the garages, and we've already done all that. In the end, the applicant was able to make that work, so you could say all is well that ends well, but I think that's illustrative of kind of what I'm talking about, where you get past a certain point an investment from our applicants, and there's a sense of vestiture that is sometimes at odds with community review.
So not to continue this line too long, but is there do either of you see any opportunity to reconcile those sometimes conflicting or competing perspectives or interests?
Well, Board Member Weistat, I think from staff's perspective, we don't see it as competing. I think because we're operating with the same set of policies and plans that the board has adopted and the commission's been engaged with. And so to date, as we've utilized this new tool, we think it's helped refine the application as it gets to the SPRC. So I from staff's perspective, and again, from what we've heard from the applicants, it's been well received. Many, as the chairman indicated, something that's been sought after for years, and we've got it in place. And again,
Let me just interrupt, though, because to the degree you can comment on John's question, which is this just a natural tension that it's just going to be like that? Or is there a potential to address that situation that might occur at times?
Mr. Chairman, I think there certainly is a way to do that. Again, that's the importance of having staff working closely with the citizen planners who serve on the Planning Commission. And certainly, I think one of the reasons we're here tonight is is to look for direction from the board in that area. But again,
Let me turn to Katie.
Well, just to that end, right, as we've sort of moved into areas for topics for discussion, it would strike me, right, that the idea of reintroducing or following up on the optional preliminary review at the SPRC level or with members of the Planning Commission or SPRC might make sense here. I'm, of the mind that we see oftentimes applicants will come not just for pre-plan review, but will go to civic associations, right? So there is some desire to have these touch points with the community, as long as it is optional. One way to mediate or alleviate some of those issues that Mr. Weisstat just raised or put a point on that were raised by Mr. Gutschall, I might think would be to reintroduce this additional optional step in the process. So I suppose that leads me to the question of, this hasn't been followed up or implemented yet because the planning commissioners are busy and there are elements of those working group recommendations, or has there been some reason this idea of an optional SPRC pre-meeting conversation hasn't been achieved yet?
Mr. Duffy might be able to give a more full answer from my perspective. I'm not actually sure what embodies implementation. There was, when one of the RAPS site plans was first starting to come forward, I actually asked the applicant, perhaps because that was also thinking of the timing of when we had sort of promulgated these desired changes, and I thought that it was actually agreed upon that these were changes. So it was sort of like, we say we're going to do it, let's do it. And I asked one of the applicants whether they were had intended on taking advantage of that and coming to the SPRC with this pre-review before their 4.1 filing. And they told me that they were not at all aware that that was an option that was available to them. And then I never heard any more about it until they came forward with a full 4.1. So I don't know if it's as simple as putting out to our developer community, that the applicants, that if you desire to convene with the SPRC, that I would certainly feel very comfortable, right, that the SPRC would be more than willing to meet with any applicant and take a look at how that fits, how that, works with, I think there is a little bit, I can respect where staff is coming from, that what they're trying to review for is not always the same thing. So I think it's not so much that the processes need to be melded together. I think that there's a role that staff is playing in terms of making sure that the application meets all of the requirements that it needs. But I think that if we put it out there, would applicants take advantage of it? I think so, but I don't know what it takes to say, hey, here's an option.
Just from staff's perspective, one of the recommendations that we made, and I think it was supported by the working group's recommendations as well, is that again, this is going to come up in your discussion, these operating guides are really important. They really do lay out the agenda, the timing, the membership, roles, the sequence, all aspects of this important site plan review committee processes, which has been so important for Arlington. And it's there, I think, from staff's perspective, that we always felt that there could be an opportunity to consider how that could be employed to address this issue. But again, it's the way we set this concept review up, I think, is to ensure that the investment that applicants make very early in the process, before they get to the preliminary or final submission, that they get the best professional guidance from our interdepartmental team.
First, let me go to, if this is on the same topic, Christian, if it isn't, I'll go back to John for a follow-up. Is this?
Of course it's on the same topic.
I'm listening.
Anyway, okay, so trying to figure out what exact problem we're trying to solve, I'm hearing that we want to prevent, on some level, the expenditure of resources unnecessarily that need to be changed as a result of the natural process that we desire. And I think, part of that is certainly noble, but we have to understand, what happens in the real world, where All buildings are not just owned by a single entity, and sometimes they're engaged with equity partners and others for whom pretty pictures and drawings are required to get buy-in and support, often on their own initiative. People seek to develop a political constituency, as Katie mentioned, with civic associations. So sometimes, despite our own desires and best interests, on their own initiative, people come with a significant expenditure of resources just to try and garner the support that's needed to either move forward or they think is politically savvy to do so. So I think we need to segregate what it is we require versus what it is people may decide to do based on their own, and caveat emptor. If they expend that based on their own desires, we're not responsible for that. But to the end of figuring out what exactly we require, while I think always engaging people early makes sense, it seems to me that if you do that optional SPRC convening early on the concept level, you're just shifting the SPRC process to happen a little earlier. I'm not sure it's functionally any different than having another layer of meetings, but I'm sure you could work out those details in a way that makes sense. So the question becomes what exactly we're looking for in the SPRC process compared to the staff concept review. And Commissioner Siegel, we've had some conversations about axonometric drawings, for example, to give that sense of massing and utility and flow and relationship with the neighborhood as a way of socializing with builders and developers what exactly we are looking for at the stage of citizen review and what exactly we are expecting you to receive input on and to, based on feedback, to adjust your projects accordingly if it makes sense. Can we do a better job of communicating those outcomes or those desires in advance so we make very clear what it is, this is what you need to show us in order to have us be able to review your project, and if you go above and beyond, that's on you, if I'm making myself clear.
Thank you, County Board Member. And we do that in these 4.1 administrative regs that we adopt. In these regs are the specific types of studies, drawings from an engineering perspective, from an architectural standpoint, landscape architecture, traffic engineering, and so on. It lays those out for the various phases of that site plan process. And that's really the starting point. When we introduced the concept level review, we wanted to take it back even further so that before that investment was be made. Because quite often, if we're starting to make changes in, let's say, Commissioner Gutschall mentioned the loading dock, sometimes a change in just a simple, sounds like a loading dock, can ripple through tens and hundreds of drawings and specs and sheets through the plan process. So we're looking for a very basic set of drawings that look at massing form, basic orientation and access to ensure that at an early stage, we're giving additional guidance in conjunction with this document once they file their preliminary and ultimately their final to start through the plan, the formal plan review process.
Mr. Chair, may I respond? Thank you, Mr. Dorsey. I think actually, you're asking the question, I think, fundamentally, how do we want good architecture, we want good urban design, so how do we get that out of the process? So how do you lay that out in terms of what we're looking for? I actually would submit to you that that's the whole point of the process, because it can be very subjective. There's competing goals, there's trade-offs. You're constantly looking at all of that. And it's my understanding and impression that what we value in Arlington is we've valued citizen input in that, in terms of if you've got a trade-off to be made between a loading dock location and the ease and the circulation, but the pedestrian friendliness, and are you looking at, where you're loading the parking versus where you're doing other things, those are all trade-offs, and that's part of the conversation that we have. So your point about that, are we just, if we allow the SPRC to have some input earlier, optional or not, earlier in the process, does that move things up? I think maybe it does, but that's probably a good thing, because that's the whole point. We started this whole effort back in 2013 because we accepted the feedback from our developer community that we were taking too long. We were getting too far down with a set of drawings or whatever, and then trying to circle back on fundamental issues. So the diagrams that Commissioner Siegel has been talking about with you and all, those are all efforts, I think, to have less cost for our developers and more opportunity for people to see things, not the pretty pictures. And I get that, you know, developers may still need to do the pretty pictures for their other reasons, but more opportunity to really look at how does this application fit into all of these things that we are trying to balance. So to me, the bottom line is it's all a balancing act and it's trade-offs, and that's why the community input is so valuable, in my view, earlier rather than later.
And I don't think I disagree. I just think if it's a convening of the full SPRC with no change into what you require and what you're looking for as part of that, you haven't added a level of what you're describing to the process. You've just moved it, which I would encourage, if there's a way to move this forward, that it be fundamentally different than what a developer would experience once they hit
Mr. Duffy is entirely correct that that's where the operating guide, I think, becomes critical, and that is part of what we're talking about here tonight, is moving forward with updating the operating guide.
John?
Yeah, so the bottom line is that all of this is ultimately at an applicant's own risk, substantially. So it strikes me that, I mean, it would be my perspective that through the operating guide, maybe we beef up a reference to and encourage the option of an early reach out to the SPRC. Not make it mandatory, not require it, but encourage it, and you know, and the applicant can let ultimately the chips fall where they may. If we're ready to move on, I have another question, but you're probably going to make the rounds. Right, okay, sure.
Let me just say,
I know, excuse me, Mr. Fazette. I had a statistical question. How many applicants are taking advantage of this right now? In overall percentage terms, Mr. Duffy, would you say? And if they are taking advantage of it, of that subset, how many are not going forward with their full application ultimately? In other words, they've gotten an early read and they've decided for whatever reason they're not coming back.
I believe we've had 5, possibly 6 applicants that have gone through the process to date. We currently have 3 that are in the process today, and 2 of them are in Roslyn, involving very complex sites, and 1 is in Shirlington. In terms of the 3 that we're currently in the midst of.
so what about the other 2?
They're in phase 1 and 2 right now?
The 3 that we have today are currently in the concept level review. We have had, I believe, probably 6 or 7 that have completed the process to date. And not all of them have filed based on the preliminary review. And keep in mind, currently, this preliminary review, there is no fee. And so it is advantageous to the applicant to seek that early consultation, if you will. And again, as Ms. Byrd indicated, the concept review is not something new. We've been doing it for years. We've just brought it all together, given it clarity. We've made it more concise in terms of what the process should be. And I think for the applicant, a better sense of what we're looking for when they actually file the preliminary.
Mr. Fazette?
Yep,
Yeah,
Ms.
I can just follow up,
Garvey.
because I noticed you said there's no fee. Is there any reason the applicant wouldn't want to go through this? So if there's no fee and it seems totally advantageous, are you getting some feedback for some reasons that they wouldn't want to do it?
We had one case recently where I think the applicant would have benefited significantly from the concept level review. And
Realize that.
well, I think there were a number of circumstances that contributed to the process they chose, but I think the concept review phase would have made a significant difference in the project as it got to the commission, to the SPRC, and ultimately to the board.
Let me just comment that as we move maybe on to another topic, I was taken by couple of these comments, which are very good, and we're here to give some guidance, but I think maybe just some feedback is a better way to say it, because unless we all felt really strongly about something that should happen, I think what we're hoping is you just hear our questions, hear our conversation, and then take it into account as you work on the operating guide and refining the processes that you've begun to put in place. I was taken by Eric's example because while cited as a potential issue, it also was a success in that, in this case, despite the preliminary discussion, it got to the Planning Commission, and the staff and the applicant still were open enough to respond to the Planning Commission input. The problem would have been had that not been the case. So, okay. Then the idea that's popped up from some here about having this optional reach out, optional opportunity to go to site plan seems to me something that deserves some thought, especially since it's optional, may be seen as valuable. And what Katie asked, which was, I think, very instructive here, which is, don't the applicants go to the neighborhoods? And honestly, that's not a small thing, because if an applicant is choosing to go kind of market their project and get support or see what trade-offs maybe they need to make with a neighborhood, that leaves me a little uncomfortable that our sort of community-wide body that is vested in representing the broadest part of the community and our planning principles is at something of a disadvantage to maybe an immediate neighborhood.
Mr. Chair, it's a great point. And if you remember Big Idea 1 that came from the Site Plan Review Committee, that was at the heart of it in terms of how far out in front sometimes an applicant gets. We have a case that will start with the Site Plan Review Committee this fall. And it happens to be in Clarendon. And there's been a great deal of discussion out in the community about that case. And while we've been providing early guidance, that was an issue that the Planning Commission, the Site Plan Review Committee, and the working group discussed somewhat at length as they were putting their recommendations forward. So it's a good point.
And I just wanted to say, the process, just the way it's designed, it's very dynamic. So at all different stages, there are applicants that are doing many different things. They're talking to the community, they're talking to staff, they're talking to, the political interests as well. And so it's going to be difficult to, I don't know at what point you can really corral all of that into a single process that everybody is happy with, understanding that they've all received the same thing at the same time and everybody can move forward in a place of unison. I think that's one thing to recognize. It's a very dynamic process just by the nature of it.
Katie? No, okay, then
I wanted to pull a
we're
thread
both going. Go ahead.
I think that's such a fair point, and I think that really becomes why it's really important to codify in this operating guide or wherever else that none of this is binding, none of this is an approval, none of this is a commitment of support from our staff, from our planning commission, from the neighborhoods. But I do, I'm nodding vigorously as Jay makes that point, because I think it's exactly right, and we find ourselves, this is a stereotypical example because it's one that we see often, right, which is the nearest neighbors might, as their greatest concern, have density. And that forecloses options for open space, right, as we've talked about, because sometimes those things are trade-offs. I know, Eric really made that good point about trade-offs. And so hearing from a body that we ask to represent more at-large or countywide interests simultaneously to getting feedback from the nearest interest, because that's what we do throughout our planning processes, right, or balance the interests of the whole with those most directly impacted. So just really wanted to vigorously agree and also say, and we obviously have a role to play as well as reinforcing those commitments as county board members. Just because an applicant went through pre-plan review or an optional preliminary review, none of that represents a binding commitment.
And so at least for me, tying up my thinking on this, taking into account what Samia just said as well, which is true, this is a dynamic process. You can't say to an applicant, you can't go to the neighborhood. Of course, they can go wherever they want. That's part of their own strategy or thinking, or sometimes very helpful to them, right? But the main focus here and tonight is the roles of the folks at the table, which is the staff, the planning commission, and then the board. And at this point, the board is the least of the players. I mean, honestly, we're not really involved, though an applicant may come to us as well. They aren't going to get much out of that, honestly, I hope. I mean, it's really not our role at that point. But I am focused on the role of the staff and the planning commission, and what I see as probably the strongest partnership in this in the end, which is working with the same goals in mind. And an applicant does not always have those. I mean, many conform to them and do it willingly, but that isn't their driving motivation in all instances, as it is for the planning commission and as it is for the staff. So it just strikes me that with that neighborhood point in mind, that some option needs to be understood about how to better integrate or better inform or better somehow engage, allow for the planning commission. And that could be that even when you do your work, you have the chair of the SPRC tasked to this project in the room with you to be a liaison, or it's that optional review to the SPRC. And there may be numerous ways to try to not put the planning commission at a quote disadvantage, but be aware. At a minimum, it's the awareness and maybe some modest input that comes at an earlier place. And that's because I respect too what Christian said, is that if you just back this up, you're just backing the whole thing up. And that isn't the point either. So is there a way to allow a better integration and awareness by the Planning Commission to be informed and not feel that they're just handed something that's fait accompli or de facto done, when in fact some citizens may have had more input into it than they did. So I think we can move on from there if that sort of captures some of the conversation.
And just one final editorial comment. I know years ago when I was on the Planning Commission, if I'm remembering it correctly, and it just might be Ms. Byrd, you're now in this exalted role, but I remember very specifically that you, in your role then, would, as you were preparing SPRC chairs, would essentially relay all of that information that took place in the informal concept review at that time as preparation for us SPRC chairs to go ahead and lead a process. So we do have the bones of this in place, and maybe there's just a more thoughtful, codified way that we can make sure it's not only replicated over and over, but that it has a chance to impact each and every planning commissioner.
Okay, let's go to the next. I think, folks, we're on the slide 12, right? Bob, are there other, and I'm asking anyone on the board as well, are there other site plan review committee working group recommendations? We've just focused on the optional concept site plan review and the optional preliminary review. Are there others that we should look at and give you any advice, feedback about?
I've got it. So again, this slide summarizes each of the ideas.
By the way, I'd ask that of you, staff or the Planning Commission. Is there anything up here that you think deserves a little further conversation?
I'm going to go back to the operating guides that I think both Chair Gutschall and this presentation have gone through. Because many of those points really go back to, I think, the content of the operating guides. We have the vice chair of the Planning Commission here this evening, who also chairs the Site Plan Review Committee. And Ms. Commissioner Siegel and I have had a lot of discussion about this agenda, and which is a big part of the operating guides. And so I think one of the things that we're looking forward to working through with the commission and the SPRC is, and again, part of the operating guide, is how can that agenda best be organized and adapted to a specific application, and what materials should the applicant and should staff be able to provide to ensure that we can support that important public process that has been in place now for for several decades and led.
About the fifth bullet up here, restructure review agenda.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, Commissioner Seal, do you want to comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the issues that struck me as very key, most important to address first, when I compared the standard agenda that we now use and the revised agenda that was proposed at the end of, I think it was 16, at the end of 15, sorry, is that, and having just recently reviewed the operating guide again, the thrust of the review, or the beginning of the review, the SPRC review begins with the building, the proposal, which I think that's common sense. However, because the Planning Commission is charged with representing the public interest, that would mean that the interest in the creation of the public space that a building creates. We had a very interesting seminar with the urban planning group in the staff, starting with a description of what is public space. Public space is created between two buildings. So I thought that what the revised agenda suggests is to start a review with the context of where a new building would be, is being proposed or redeveloping. Context in terms of the built environment, the plans, the entitlements, the environmental circumstances. Is there an RPA involved? Things like that. So that.
Jane, let me ask you then, I don't know how many of us have ever looked through the operating guide. I bet probably not many of us. Maybe Christian remembers it. Years ago. But the question is,
The agenda is in the operating guide.
Are you talking about thinking through how to redesign the agenda in a way that would be applied to each SPRC process?
Correct. Sorry for being unclear. The SPRC Site Plan Review Committee agenda is part of the operating guide.
Clarify for all of us, the operating agenda is wholly 100% product of the Planning Commission?
Yes.
Or is it traditionally done sort of collaboratively? I'm assuming there's some collaboration in this, right?
Historically, the operating guide, which was last revised in 2010, and that time it was a product or an effort by one or more planning commissioners.
They created it.
They created it, and they've been revising it for some time. And so it really has been an effort in the past led by the commission.
Okay, gotcha.
Mr. Chair, the individual site plan chairs, so of each project, have the prerogative and have exercised that in consultation with staff to adjust, based on the project, because not all projects, have all of the same elements, or some things are. And I think a great example of that recently was RAPS, right? RAPS was being, in particular, the Penzance site was being, reviewed in a different context because we had a very specific.
Well, I assume it's a guide. I mean, it's a guide.
Except I would just add that the revised agenda that the Planning Commission worked on in 14 to 16, I think it was, does make a significant change to the unfolding of information. I mean, I think that's one way to put it. What do you look at first? You look, and I feel this is having read it and thought about it, we have not discussed it. This Planning Commission has not yet discussed it. It is, to me, best to start with the context, because at the end of the day, the Planning Commission will be advising you on this new entity that will be created in the context of what's there in Arlington.
So I think we've actually moved to, on the last slide here, B, which is the operating guide revisions. You all, is it is it accurate to say you're looking to update? And it's you, I'm looking at everybody, but led by the Planning Commission, looking to update the operating guide. Is that?
We included in our work program for 18 staff resources and hours to work in partnership with the Commission SPRC to complete that. And our goal will be try to make as much progress as we can by the end of this calendar year.
Yep, Jane, do you have your line?
I do, but on a different topic, I mean, related.
I just have one more point. While it's true that the traditionally in practice has been, this is the SPRC's agenda, has been developed by the SPRC, used by the SPRC, there's no doubt that good, constructive collaboration with staff is key and critical. We should not be operating independently, and we don't.
Yeah.
So redoubling our efforts.
Fit the best if it's collaborative, there's no question. John?
So looking at the first bullet on 10 and keying off the site plan review committee, let me raise another topic. Schools is being talked about in all sorts of dimensions these days. It's one of our biggest challenges, both where to put them and what to do with them when we decide, the collective, we decide where they're going to go. So in the Thomas Jefferson context, there was basically a joint or a hybrid BLPC and SPRC combo, which seemed to work pretty well. And I'd be happy for Ms. Crystal to give her own perspective. But so extrapolating from that, here's my question. Do you think that going forward in planning new schools, additions to existing schools, and so forth, that joint BLPC, PFRC concept has legs for other contexts? And regardless of if you do or not, what sort of ideas might you offer up for better and more coordinated planning for schools with the county board?
So, Mr. Vice Chair, I think you used two acronyms there. We throw a lot of acronyms around, and then you kind of corrected yourself. So one is SPRC, Site Plan Review Committee. The other is PFRC, as you know, Public Facility Review.
Right, yeah.
And while they are very similar in many ways, they are actually fundamentally different. The membership of PFRC is very different. And I had actually, I don't feel in a position to answer whether or not the blending of that worked well, or what parts of it worked well or didn't work well. I've asked around, and I think that there seems to be some differing schools of thought on that, and I think there's lessons learned and things to work with moving forward. But as it relates particularly to the Planning Commission, because the Planning Commission has some membership, and it is a planning commissioner who is the chair of the PFRC. The PFRC is really, and especially the BLPC, is really very distinct from the Planning Commission. So to the extent that this conversation is focused on what are we doing with site plans and the Planning Commission, it's a little bit of a different beast. Do you understand what I'm?
No, I understand what you're saying, but I thought I'd take advantage of the venue here to see what your thoughts were in that regard. And Ms. Crystal, I don't know if you have any particular
I was just going to
perspective.
comment, and Mr. Vice is looking to me as the liaison to that process. I have many thoughts of my own, but I also just wanted to note that we did task staff with and ask them to, as part of the approval of the use permit for Thomas Jefferson, to please come back to us with some reflections, having done sort of an informal set of conversations with the chairs of the various processes about takeaways. And I know we're eager to receive that, and one of those takeaways to be, whether we ought to consider this blended model going forward. So we talked about potentially having that in the context of our work session week after next with the school board. That is becoming a very crowded work session. So, if we don't get to it, I know it remains an item for keen discussion.
Mr. Duffy, what do you think of the timing in that regard? I mean, are you marshaling your thoughts, and would you hope to have actual conclusions, or is it still a little too preliminary?
Well, I think it's too preliminary. As County Board Member Crystal indicated, we're working very closely with the County Manager's Office. It's really interdepartmental team that works with APS staff, and so it's important that we have the opportunity to do that and provide the manager with a report. So we're still working on that.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman, before Mr. Schroll goes, not that I don't want to hear from you, James, but can we get some clarity as to what are the topics that we are going to hit in the remaining time that we have and what the desired feedback or points of feedback from the board are? So you can think of that while Mr. Schroll.
Mr. Vice-Ed, I'm the PFRC chair, and my predecessor, Commissioner Sockwell, led most of the TJ process. He led it in its entirety with his colleague on the BLPC, Megan. And I think generally the takeaway, as we've been talking about, was that it was a positive process. The collaboration was generally positive. I think going forward, I think my recommendation would be that the size of the group needs to be smaller, especially that.
Smaller.
Yeah, the BLPC is a large group. It pulls from PTAs, it pulls from a kind of a large group, and when you combine that with PFRC, it becomes a large group, and it kind of unbalanced, I think. And so sometimes you had more BLPC members and you had PFRC, and so it didn't seem like it was always equal footing. It also kind of became one of those things where everything's been said, but not by everybody, and so that can kind of become difficult in a meeting. But I do think it was positive. I do think what we face in other PFRCs where a BLPC or a couple BLPC meetings would happen before the next PFRC. So the building got designed more rapidly on the inside, which affected how the exterior and the public realm was designed. So BLPC members got to weigh in more frequently than PFRC. And so those timelines weren't in sync before. And so I think having them, most of the meetings we had on TJ were joint meetings except for 2. And so I think that was a positive thing because those decisions were happening mostly simultaneously, which I think benefited both the school side, but also the county side.
Not to take away from the discussion about BLPC and PFRC, which we are going to try to debrief when we have the work session on the 27th about that. But in terms of SPRC, and we're talking about reviewing specific site plan projects and applications, the way the committee is designed is that it includes a number of different commissions, entities, and as each project is established to go forward through the process, staff and the SPRC chair work together to determine who would be additional members to include on that committee. So I don't know that it's necessary to have another committee that's with SPRC jointly reviewing something, because the way that structure is set up, all of the people will be at the table necessary to weigh in on the application. So for instance, if there is a schools-related aspect to a project, there could be discussion with the SPRC chair and staff and the applicant as to whether or not we should include someone from APS on the SPRC committee to help review the project. So I think the mechanism is in place to allow the different entities and different factions to come to the table to discuss a single project.
Okay, so just my last follow-up then, any other schools-related observations as a lead-up to the work session that the school board and the county board are going to have upcoming, offhand?
Honestly, no. I feel like as a community, we know what we need to do, and we're very committed now and ready to set out to do what we need, which is to develop a comprehensive plan of how we're going to meet all of the facility needs, not just schools, but fire stations, and looking for those opportunities to co-locate things. So I feel like we know what we need to do, and I think that staff is on the right track here.
Okay.
Let me try
Thank you.
and answer Christian's question. Looking at the last slide, and this is why on B, which is now that we are all aware, part of this is educating. It's a little different. We're not being asked to give specific direction on various questions like we would in a planning process. But this was part to educate all of us, ask for feedback on some of the next steps you're taking, which are around updating your operating guide, hopefully by the end of the year or shortly thereafter. And then the orientation and training. So I would just ask that in the last, and I think we'd all be happy if we ended a little early tonight, So under B, if there are any other elements of the operating guide revisions that you would like to highlight, number one, then we'll go to the last item, which is just updating us and looking for any feedback necessary about your suggestions around orientation and training, which have been nominal to date. And that's really the rest of the agenda. And if we finish that at the next 10 minutes and then we can go watch election returns, I think we'll all be happy. And before we go to the next item, though, I am going to ask this. There aren't that many people in the room. I'm going to ask everyone to quickly stand up and introduce yourself. Starting over here. Yeah. Thank you. All right.
James Schroll, Plan Commission, here for seat.
Welcome.
Jim Lantelme, Planning Commission. David Riggs, Planning Commission.
All right. And we know Steve. Okay. All right. Thank you all. And thanks for all the planning commissioners that are here joining us tonight. So anything more on item B to highlight? Yep.
Mr. Fazette, there was one of the bullets there that had to do with a shorter term review, which I think was otherwise discussed as site plan light. This was something that was talked about a lot back in 2013. I think has perhaps fallen by the wayside, and I think I'm raising it for the board here because if it's something that there is interest in pursuing, we would need to sort of, I think, reignite that interest there because that's in my view, a little bit of a heavier lift, but something that could be very important as we move forward. And we're looking at, for example, creating new tools for incentivizing redevelopment along places like Lee Highway, where we might want something of the ability of to have a process that is not as expensive as our major as a current site plan process is, but that allows for redevelopment of smaller parcels and et cetera. So I just want to highlight that for the board because if that's something we want to look at.
Mr. Chairman, just briefly, we certainly concur with the chair, but just looking back, if you remember my first comment on slide 6, when we started this process and looked at the site plan review committee process in 2000, from 2012 to 14, we were seeing from the filing date to the county board action, 306 days. And since, after we completed both of these efforts, we've been able to reduce that, at least looking back at 2016 and 17, to 65 to 120 days. And we've achieved the same comprehensive process. We've been able to engage the community effectively, and it's made a significant difference. We can always do more, and we're looking forward to working with the Planning Commission on the operating guide to continue to improve the process. But we have come a long way in the last couple of years, and I think that should be noted. In a large part, it's really due to the work of our citizen planners who serve.
Was that by way of saying you think this is something you would want to take up yourselves or not? This shorter term?
Well, I think the point I was making is that at that time, the term was so long. It was 306 days. We've reduced it significantly. So the issue on site plans isn't as, I think, critically important as I think it was then.
I'm going to put words in your mouth, Bob. What I'm hearing is not at the top of our list.
Not at the top of our list.
Okay.
But as we begin planning efforts, as Chairman Gutschall said, if we can find some new ways to do business, we're going to do it.
And so let me leave it at that and just say that to the degree as we look at accomplishing other goals in the community, whether it's affordable housing goals or certain priority redevelopment, people always look, energy goals, solar. A lot of people are looking for ways to expedite processes to accomplish various policy goals. It's always out there as an option. One of my things is, you hear it all the time, everyone wants an expedited process for everything, so you obviously have to do it in a very focused, limited way, and I'm sure it'll pop up as various policy goals are pursued and considered new tools for them in the future. Christian, do you have your microphone on?
No, I don't need to comment, thanks.
Should we go to the last item, which is training? Would you like to share with us what your plans are, what
Just
your thinking
briefly,
is?
looking, for many years, our staff has provided new and certainly long-term planning commissioners with a number of resources. And Michelle Stallard, who's there tonight, as well as Giselle, who's our clerk, have played a critical role in that. And we've just briefed over the last several months 4 new planning commissioners. We maintain, I think, a great sort of introductory and onboarding guide with a lot of good material. We've recently updated, as part of the county's commitment to our webpage, to provide an additional resource for the commission. And something that I think periodically gets overlooked that we've done about 18 months ago is we created a planning resource library, not only for the Planning Commission, but for the community at large on a number of new issues and ideas that are coming forward related to planning, transportation, and so on. And we keep that up to date. So we have this core work that's certainly important. But as we discussed with several of our new planning commissioners on their onboarding, they really would like to have what I'll call a Planning 101 course. We have that. We've utilized that in the past. We have indicated that we're going to update that and provide that to all the commissioners, but certainly provide that sort of tutorial, if you will, or background piece for the new commissioners going forward, including a strong piece that looks at our site plan review process, what the basis for that is under the incentive-based zoning and special exception site plan process that underpins all of that. So we are going to develop those tools.
And that'll be in-house.
That'll be in-house.
Okay.
But one area that I think is so important, and we also heard this from several of the new commissioners, is that they're soon going to be tasked with chairing site plan review committee meetings, and those can be difficult forums. And anytime we can provide some training on how to successfully facilitate and manage difficult meetings such as that, I think everyone will benefit. So we're working with other county staff to identify how we might do that. And
Again, in-house
in-house,
training.
we may go outside to look for some training resources that
It's about facilitation.
successful facilitation of meetings.
Right.
And so we're looking for a good resource,
Right.
and a new module on that we might be able to provide.
Just throw in here that I think that we've heard that's the kind of skill that is could be used for many of our commissions, many of our planning processes, our ad hoc processes. So whatever is developed here, I think, goes well beyond the Planning Commission in terms of its usefulness. I'm going to turn to Christian.
Yeah, I would just say amen to both of these initiatives. I think, when you look at the materials that you prepared, if a planning commissioner were to do all of the meetings of the Planning Commission, that'd be about 96 for the year, not to mention the liaison assignments that one may be assigned to. This would be one small bit of added value we could give to them, some successful, tangible, exportable skills in chairing meetings and dealing with difficult conversations, not to mention the benefit that it would have to making the processes work. Question is, the training 101, the planning 101, how are you envisioning doing that? Is that going to be convene people and have them, be lectured to by a number of staff? Are you thinking about sort of a webinar-based product that maybe could be exportable to people in the community? What's the thinking to what that would look like?
We want it to be both.
Okay.
Because if we're going to invest resources in updating what is a pretty good 101 guide we have today, and to bring our expert staff team to bear on this, that we can record it and update it and make it available across the board. And so it'll be a new resource. We'll call it a key part of our planning library of resources to support the community. So we're going to be committed to doing that. It will take a little time, but we're going to try to make progress by the end of the year on that.
Terrific.
All right. John, did you have a comment? We'll try to wrap it up here. We'll go down here as well.
Sure. My only comment is I just wanted to say how much I appreciate the Planning Commission's letters for each of the site plans and whatever else work you do, because it shows not only your final recommendation, but how you got there. And I also like the fact that we can see how individual planning commissioners think and what their perspectives are, including minority views. So I would hope that we could continue that robust communication back to us in the future. Thank you.
All right.
Is that-
Let's go down, Libby, then Katie, and then.
I just want to say thank you as well, because I came on in 2012, and a lot of changes have happened. And I heard a lot of concerns from the particularly development community and a number of people actually on the commission. And you really have been addressing it, both staff and the commissioners, and I really do appreciate it. And now I need to walk out, so don't take it
We're right
badly.
behind you. We're right behind you.
Okay.
Very good. You get a little head start.
I
Katie.
will, I will.
Just wanted to add my support for this idea, particularly on the facilitation training, which I think echoes a comment that Mr. Weisstat and I heard when we convened all of the commissions last year. So very supportive of the idea of looking for ways to export that in some form of module or via our fabulous network of staff liaisons to different commissions as well. And add my thanks to the work that you all do, including being with us here tonight on an exciting night where you could be elsewhere.
Siegel, you're the next to last word.
Just to say that I really do believe in apprenticeships as a learning tool. And just to assure you that we do that by appointing co-chairs to the SPRC who perhaps are new commissioner. I've been sort of pushing, inviting, cajoling, goading new planning commissioners to do that. They can have the title of co-chair or assist, whatever it is, and work through the whole process. That's the framework of learning, is the process. So I just wanted to reassure you that we are doing that as well.
Thank you very much. And let me again express my thanks and the board's thanks to all of the planning commissioners that are here, the staff that work collaboratively with the planning commission. It's the best way forward. And I think we're all encouraged by the conversation today. So thank you very much. We're adjourned.
I'll try to forgive you.